Okay, thank you, Sydney. Happy Sabbath, brethren. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. As always, to be with the Father and His Son on their Sabbath day. So today, today's message, sermonette rather, will be titled "Learning to Love Like God." Learning to love like God. Okay. So I'll just read from John chapter 3, verse 16. Sure, it's a scripture we all know by heart. It's a pivotal scripture in the Bible, of course, as are all the other scriptures. But this one, it's a well-known scripture, a beloved scripture by believers and non-believers alike, I believe. So I'll just read from John chapter 3, verse 16. It says, "For God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him should not perish, but have everlasting life." So here we see that John 3:16 reveals the love of God. It highlights and showcases it. And what is the hallmark of true love, of God's love? Well, this verse notes that it's giving, because giving is an operative word. It's one of the verbs there. So if we notice other verses, which we don't have to turn to, but you can just read for your own reference, verses such as Galatians 2 verse 20, 1 John 3 verses 1 to 2. Verses such as Galatians 2 verse 20, 1 John chapter 3 verses 1 to 2, Ephesians chapter 5 verses 1 to 2, as well as Ephesians 5 verse 25, and many others. We see that in such scriptures, everywhere where God's love is mentioned, giving is a concomitant or an operative word. Just look up those scriptures in your own time, and you'll see the amazing connection. So we see here that God's love is selfless, and it is this love that God's people are called to imitate. Again, we won't have time to turn there, but if you write down Ephesians 5 verses 1 to 2, where Paul tells us to be imitators of God who loved us and gave His Son for us. So again, we see that where God's love is mentioned, giving is follows closely behind. So how do we grow in maturity in the love of God, so that we may be imitators of God? How can we learn to love like God? So here are some ideas to grow mature in both understanding as well as applying God's love. And just to make it easier, as I like to do, I'll use the acrostic called LOVE. So LOVE will give us 4 keys to learning to love like God. So with the letter L, here I wrote, "Let His mind be in you." That's for the letter L. If we read Ephesians 2 verses 5 to 13, again, we won't turn there, but in your own time, please just refer to it. We see here that God's mindset should be embedded in us. That's Philippians 2 verses 5 to 13. So here we were told that as His thoughts penetrate our minds, actions in line with His character will soon follow, sooner or later. A verse to corroborate that would be 2 Corinthians chapter 3 verses 16 to 18, which tells us that the more we behold God's mind, the more likely that we are to then have actions that follow along God's mind. So God's mind is revealed through the writings of the Hebrew prophets, as well as the teachings of Christ and the apostles, and we read of that in Hebrews chapter 1 verses 1 to 2. So that's where we go to if we want to know what God's mind is on certain matters. So that's how we can have God's mind in us, by referring to the scriptures regularly. And then the letter O is observe the commandments. God's commandments were given for our good. We see this in Deuteronomy chapter 5 verses 29 to 33, as well as Deuteronomy chapter 10 verses 12 to 13. So it follows that since God's commandments were for our good, that when we obey them, we're being loving, just like Him, and also that we are being a blessing to others. We can see verses such as Matthew chapter 19 verses 16 to 17, 1 John chapter 2 verses 3 to 6, 1 John 5 verses 1 to 3, as well as Romans 13 verses 8 to 10. And then now the letter V is visit and vivify the weak, especially among God's people. So when we visit the weak and really try and vivify or strengthen them, that's what vivify means. With a helping and humble hand, God is always pleased. We should do this first to God's household, which is brethren and sisters in the church, and then as we're able, people out there in the world. So verses such as James chapter 1 verse 27, Galatians 6 verse 10, Luke 14 verses 12 to 14, Psalm 41 verses 1 to 2, Proverbs 19 verse 17. Such verses highlight that we should help the weak whenever we can. And then the last acrostic, the last letter in that acrostic E, is to exert effort in furthering your career, professional impact, and marketability. And the reason why we should do so is that it puts one in a better position to be able to be a blessing to others. Verses such as Proverbs 14 verse 23, Ephesians 4 verse 28, Titus 3 verse 8, among others, show that when we work with our might and we focus our attention on improving ourselves and our skills, we're able to earn an income which can bless ourselves, which can bless God's church, as well as the weak. So yes, if we learn to love, to love, to again, I'll go through the four letters of that acrostic. L, let his mind be in you, by studying the scriptures. O, observing the commandments. V, visiting and vivifying the weak. And then E, exerting effort in furthering your career so that you can be a blessing to both yourself, God, and others. If we learn to do those four things, if we learn to love, then we will mature in our Christian walk. Thank you very much, brother.